Vocal revolution. Vocal revolution. Vocal revolution. Vocal revolution. Change the world with your voice.
So welcome everyone to the Vocal Revolution, where we talk about the power of your voice to change the world personally and collectively. And thank you so much for tuning in today. If you'd like to stay tuned, please be sure to subscribe on YouTube and Apple Podcasts and share your thoughts in the comments and reviews. We're so thrilled that you're here listening and tuning in, and we'd love to hear from you. And today we're looking at one of the forms of our voices, which, as we know, can take many, many forms of expression. My guest today is here to help us understand the journey of finding our written voice, which of course we all use every day to communicate, texts, emails, posts. So really this is about exploring the world of the written voice. So I'm really delighted to welcome our guest today, novelist, short story writer and journalist Anna Sayburn Lane. Anna studied English and history at university, and then she began her career as a reporter on a South London newspaper, later moving into medical journalism. She's published 3 amazing novels, which weave literary history into contemporary thrillers and feature her literary sleuth and heroine, Helen Oddfellow, a walking tour guide and an academic who lives in Deptford. The first novel, Unlawful Things, based around the death of Christopher Marlowe, was shortlisted for the Virago New Crime Writer Award and picked as a Crime in the Spotlight choice by the Bloody Scotland Crime Writing Festival. Her second novel, The Peacock Room, takes inspiration from the London poet and artist William Blake, and the third, The Crimson Thread, returns to Christopher Marlowe and is set in Canterbury, the city of his birth. And I would say it's really remarkable that Anna has published all of these since 2018 to 2021. So that's pretty amazing to publish 3 novels in that time in my book, literally. In a case of life imitating art, Anna has now given a guided walk for the Deptford Literary Festival about literary figures in Deptford, and recently started teaching creative writing workshops. She lives between South London and the Kent coast, and I was really blessed that Anna came and joined my welcome choir in Crystal Palace, and that she also really generously invited me to join her Creative Conversations podcast. So it's just so lovely to be able to reciprocate that and to invite her to come and share her pearls of wisdom about finding our written voice today. So welcome, Anna. Hello.
Hello. Thank you. So lovely to be here.
Oh, it's so great you're here. And, you know, it's always wonderfully exciting. I mean, you write thrillers, and your thrillers are complete page turners, and they are all about following the thread of a person's journey and unraveling that. So maybe you could tell us, before we get into talking about the novels, tell us a little bit about the unraveling of your journey, your thread of writing that's run through your life, and how did you find your voice as a writer?
Yeah, well, like with most of these things, it goes a long, long way back. You know, I started writing as soon as I could write, pretty much, I think, as a small child. I recently found at my parents' place my first novel, written when I was about 9, called The Life and Times of Captain O'Neill, which was, I'd obviously been reading adventure stories, and it was all about a boy who became a cabin boy on a sailing ship, and then rose up through the ranks and became a captain of his own ship, and went off exploring the world. And that was obviously what was floating my boat at the time.
Sounds so really exciting.
Funny. So I've always written. I wrote lots of stories when I was at school. I enjoyed writing essays and so on. Then I went to university, and like a lot of people, I think, doing an English and history degree, or doing an English degree, you read, you know, the canon, the most amazing books, and you become sort of massively intimidated. And I pretty much stopped writing at that point.
Yeah.
And you know, did a huge amount of reading, obviously, which you had to do, and wrote lots of essays and all the rest of it. but it almost made it more difficult to write stories because I was thinking too much about it. And I saw this Neil Gaiman quote the other day, which I really like. Most of us find our voices only after we've sounded a lot like a lot of other people. And I think for any writer, particularly, most of us are huge readers before we become writers. And I think most of us start off trying voices out for size. If you've been reading a lot of one type of author, then you probably will start off trying to write like them. Or if you're a really big fan of a particular genre, then you might try that. And you'll probably, whether you mean to or not, sound an awful lot like the writer that you read most of. And I think kind of working my way through that took a long time. And partly it took a long time because I didn't at any stage think I'm going to be, a full-time author. I was at university, most of my friends were going off to do teaching, which is the typical thing if you do that sort of subject. And I knew I didn't want to teach. So I decided to become a journalist, which meant I had a fantastic career writing other people's stories and writing very much in the set style for whichever publication I was writing for at the time. So from local newspapers through to more professional magazines. And at one stage I was writing for a kind of women's mags. So I learned to write in lots of different styles for work. And the stories I was telling were not my stories. They weren't fiction. They weren't personal. Usually they were about somebody else. I think it was a really useful education. Not least, it gives you so much material to draw on later. A lot of my books, particularly the first book, I used quite a lot of things that I'd been writing about, stories that I'd written about as a journalist, and that sort of fed into some of the sort of plots. But I only really went back to writing fiction with any kind of intent when I hit 40, and I sort of thought, okay, I'm not really sure what I'm waiting for now. I've always wanted to write a novel, I'd better get on with it, kind of thing. So I did, and I wrote lots of short stories. I did writing courses, which were hugely useful, really, to just help me get out of my own way a bit, so I understand some of the rules of writing fiction, which you have to know about in order to be able to break them later, and to understand a bit about structuring a novel. Structure is always the biggest problem for me, so the thing that I struggle with. And so when I started doing creative writing classes, taking classes, that was what I wanted to understand, was how on earth do you construct a plot? It's looking at it from the outside, and any plot of any well-written novel, it just looks like some sort of miracle. How did they take all of that stuff and weave it together and make this, this house of cards that all stands up, whereas my house of cards tended to fall down after about 3 chapters. So yeah, it took a long time to work out how to do that. The answer is, by the way, one step at a time. Keep building on it and building on it and building on it, and have faith. So I suppose the sort of books I wanted to write changed as well. So I think if I look back, when I was a teenager at school, I was kind of writing, the sort of romances you saw in Just 17 or Jackie magazine or whatever. And by the time I was writing in my 40s, I'd moved out of sort of wanting to write kind of terribly literary novels that, broke all the rules and used no punctuation or anything like that. And I wanted to write the sort of novels that I actually enjoyed reading, which were not novels pretending to be Virginia Woolf or whatever. They were well-written, good, pacey novels with a plot. So that's what I set out to try and do.
Fantastic. And you've absolutely done it. They're just, they are really fast-paced plots. And as I said, I've read all 3, and they're just such page turners. I was definitely up very late one night trying to finish and then frightening myself to death, because of course there's lots of grisly murders and crimes involved as well. But thank you for that. And that's a very, like, almost a metaphor for life, isn't it? When you're saying about plotting things out, you have to just go one step at a time and keep the faith. That's quite a message for life. And what would you say your where you are now in your plot? Because it was lovely to hear how your personal plot has kind of unraveled, and how wonderful to hear that your journalism has infused your novels, and to hear that cross weaving of our experiences, which I think as creatives is something that we do, is we draw on all our raw material from all the different parts of our lives, from our 9-year-old novelist to our mature journalist self. There's so much material, isn't there? And the preciousness of that early voice, and perhaps recovering that and finding that in a new way as an adult. But what would you say your kind of mission is now for the written word, and also maybe how you endeavor to share it with others? Because I know you're sharing creative workshops now as well.
My mission at the moment is really to write more write more of the sort of books that I want to read. I mean, that's what it comes back to. And the sort of books that I really enjoy are books that are very entertaining, but are also I'll learn something. And that's probably the thread that connects all the types of books that I enjoy, because I read, like most writers, I think I read quite widely across different genres. But what will make a book stay with me, I read a lot of historical fiction, and that's largely because I'm learning something that I didn't know before. Historical fiction is absolutely the best way of learning history.
Yes.
I shouldn't say that as an historian, but it's so much fun. I've also learned how to research for writing, so I enjoy doing historical research. The influences on my books at the moment come from absolutely everywhere. They come from what's happening in the present day. So certainly the book that I'm working on at the moment it's pretty much set now, minus a couple of months really. So I didn't want to write a pandemic novel, but I wanted to write a novel where the people have been through it and that's had an impact on them. So I didn't want to write about the day-to-day of sort of isolation and masks and COVID tests and the rest of it, but I wanted to be writing with those characters, with my character Helen Oddfellow, having been through 2 years where it's been really hard and she's not been able to see her friends, and she's been through that sort of same kind of isolation that we've all been through. So that's kind of feeding into it. Work that volunteering that I do with a refugee charity, and what I've learned through that, some of that's feeding into the plot of the current novel. But then so is Charles Dickens, and Dickens has been a big favourite author of mine all my life, and the books always have a sort of writer that they're kind of based around, or who's very important to them, and Dickens is that one for this novel in progress. So I've sort of woven this mystery around the early work of Charles Dickens and his first novel. Well, it's often seen as his first novel, Oliver Twist, although you can make arguments about that. So everything that kind of, and like you say, all of the influences that go into it, I mean, they go back to having watched Oliver Twist as a musical as a child, having reread it now, everything I've learned about Charles Dickens, the pandemic, just about anything you could mention that I've heard about or read about is going to feed in, or could feed in one way or another. So inspiration is absolutely all around. And I think that's probably the first thing that I would say to people who want to write, because often people say, I really want to write, but I'm not sure what to write about. Well, okay, so just write about what's on your mind at the moment. What are you thinking about at the moment? And for people particularly who haven't written before, or haven't written creatively before, the first thing is to sort of say, look, it's not scary, because you do this already. You already write. We all write. We send each other text messages, WhatsApp messages, we write Facebook posts, we write shopping lists. Everyone writes. We're an incredibly literary culture, whether you would think of it as literature or not. So one of the exercises that I do for my creative writing classes is say, okay, what's the last thing that you wrote, that you actually wrote down? Is it an exchange of text messages? Is it a shopping list or whatever? Okay, now take that and make it creative by, for example, you use an exchange of text messages to set up with your friend the best night out you can possibly imagine. What would that look like? Write a Facebook page in which you talk about your favorite day or your best ever day, or write us a packing list for your dream holiday. So it's something that kind of gets your imagination going, but it's not, because people worry a lot about style and about, I don't have a highfalutin style or whatever. Well, for one, highfalutin style is usually horrible to read, so that's fine. But if you're just using the sort of words that you use in everyday life, then it stops being scary, and you can then start to bring in things. So you can then start to think about, well, if I was telling this story to a friend who I'd not seen for a while, how would I start it? What would the first thing would I start off by saying, you will never believe what's just happened to me? And then everyone's like, ooh, ooh, tell me more. So you sort of set up the story, and then how do you make it more interesting? And you maybe use suspense, or you use humor, or you try and use metaphors and images to give sensory details, to sort of to make people feel like they were there. And that's exactly the sort of techniques that you're going to be using in a novel to kind of draw people into the action. So a lot of writing is just about taking the sort of techniques that we use anyway when we're talking to our friends, and bringing them into our writing. So it's not magic. Sometimes it feels a little bit like magic, but it isn't magic. It's very much, skills that you've already got, and just learning how to bring them together.
Yeah, it's sort of transferring, isn't it, from everyday life. And I love that exercise. That's a really good one to just break down because there's so much, as you said. I also did a literature degree, and I came out with my head stuffed full of books, which I loved, but I also was then kind of quite creatively incapacitated because I was so full of other people's ideas and the reverence for other people's ideas as well, which had been an amazing learning curve. But but I think that can be a big stumbling block to people, to say, how can I say I'm a writer when there were all these other great writers, and they've all been, and we know, of course, that historically only certain types of writer have been held up to us sometimes in a patriarchal society. So sometimes we may feel that our voice is not as valid perhaps as other voices in the sort of zeitgeist, let's say, but fortunately that's changing now, and it is becoming diversifying. But I think one of that things is just coming back down to that thing that we all write and we all have a voice, and therefore we can all express ourselves through what the written idiom, as you say, and just starting with what you do every day and making that a little bit more is and I love the idea of creating suspense as well, because I know one of your novels starts with your villain cleaning a gun, and that's just such a great enticing thing, because immediately you're thinking, oh no, what's going to happen with this gun, and all that. It's such a great, you're sucked in from the word go, so I love that you think, what could be my hook point? And we use those all the time, again, in life. If something's just happened to us, or we express that with each other. And life is, I've got to tell you this, or I've got, this thing has happened, or whatever, so life is full of hook points, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
And so thank you for sharing all of those wonderful tips. And I wanted to also say about your amazing heroine, because you touched on her and the journey she's been on, and that you're also going to take her on the journey of recovery from pandemic. So I really look forward to hearing that journey. But I wondered, were there a specific person that inspired you, or certain role models you have? Because she is amazing. She's shinning up In one of them, she's shinning up drain pipes in a red satin dress. She's chasing after murderers. She's just an incredible, inspiring, and also very real. And she's very real and beautifully drawn personality. So I wondered if there was an inspiration for her somewhere in life.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, yes, she is. There was a sort of jumping off point for her in terms of inspiration, because I have a friend who is a London walking tour guide, and walking around London with her is completely amazing because she spots things all the time. She's incredibly observant, and she'll notice things and know about things that I won't even have noticed. We'll sort of walk down the street. Oh, look at that. That means that house used to be owned by such and such, or someone who was in this guild or whatever. And I thought, God, this is so interesting. You see a place so differently through someone's eyes when they have all this specific knowledge.
Yes.
And I was kind of playing with the idea of I wanted to write a thriller. I was actually the original inspiration for thinking I must be able to write something like this was Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. Right. And I wanted to read a novel that was as exciting and as fast-paced as that also brought in lots of interesting stuff, but that was frankly less cringy to read some of the dialogue, because I don't think even he would say that dialogue's his strength, for example. So I was thinking, well, what profession would be? I didn't want it to be, another sort of university professor or whatever. But I was thinking, London tour guide would be. These people know London so well, and also she, knows her stuff so well. I thought this would be quite interesting, and so that kind of sparked me off along the idea that perhaps she was a tour guide, and then obviously I gave her lots of my own interests, like Christopher Marlowe and literature and so on. But beyond that, I mean, she's really, she's just like a much braver and more intelligent version of me. She's the me I wish I could be. She's also 6 foot. I thought that if I made her really tall, then no one would think that I was, this was meant to be me, because I'm really quite short. But it's probably just wish fulfillment again.
You've invented a beautiful alter ego, and yes, I'm sure she does express many of your qualities and your bravery and your risk taking, and that's coming out through your writing. It's always a risk to put marks on a page, and to express ourselves. So you're being courageous with your writing, and have been throughout your career, I'm sure, having to write about all sorts of things. So yeah, it is a courageous act, I believe, and you're right, we do learn through your novel. We learn so much, and I also enjoy a lot of historical fiction for that reason, because it is a really fun way to learn history, especially if it's very clever the way you guide us through the eyes of someone who knows about history and who knows about literature. And so your novels have this lovely multi-layered, because you've got the world of the artist, whether it's William Blake or Marlowe, or it's going to be Dickens, very exciting. You're in that world with them, but you're also in the contemporary world with what's going on there, and also the sort of the world of the study of that person as well, and the kind of literary world as well of how that person's artistry is now being transmitted today. So there's kind of all these different levels going on, and then as well a really racy drama going on as well that's happening. Whoa, what's going to happen next? And it's all powered by a great sense of momentum, which I really love. But I love that you weave all those threads together. It's fantastic.
Sometimes some of the weaving has to happen afterwards. I think it will this time as well. I'm sort of racing ahead with, I can see the end of the thriller plot in sight, and I seem to have lost my literary plot somewhere, and I'm going to have to go back and, weave it back in, I think.
Yeah, put Dickens in under the place where the person gets stabbed or something. And I was wondering if you'd had to, as a journalist, write about a lot of crime, because or what made you go for a crime thriller particularly?
I don't think I realised I'd written a crime thriller until after I'd written it, when I was trying to pitch it to agents.
Yes.
And people were saying, well, what genre is it? And I sort of tried to describe it, and then someone said, oh, it's crime then. Like, oh, okay, that's what it is.
That's great.
Yeah. Did I covered some crime, certainly. On local newspapers, I used to cover, well, everything, but including crime. So yeah, I used to do the police rounds, and you'd go around the police stations on a Monday morning usually and sort of see what had happened over the weekend, and if there was anything exciting, they'd kind of go through the crime book with you. And occasionally I'd go out on the police would sort of take you out on for, you know, an evening in a patrol car, that sort of thing. And I mean, the big thing that I remember from my first few years in journalism, I hadn't been working very long at all, was, you know, the dreadful murder. I was working in South London of Stephen Lawrence, and Stephen died in a part of London that I was covering at the time, and which I knew quite well. And so I was one of the reporters from the paper, kind of covering the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of his death. And then also all of the protests and, you know, his funeral, I remember very well, was absolutely heartbreaking. But there were also some protests where there was the, you know, anti-Nazi League on one side, and then there were also the British National Party turned up as well. And a couple of those protests turned quite violent. And there's a scene in Unlawful Things of street fighting breaking out and the police being unable to, you know, sort it out. And the journalist who, my journalist character, who in some ways is actually closer to me, I think, than Helen, in terms of, you know, who I feel more like sometimes, who's covering the protest, ends up getting bashed over the back of the head and loaded into an ambulance. And that actually happened to me at one of these protests. I did get bashed over the back of the head and loaded into an ambulance.
Wow.
So yeah, so some of those experiences certainly came through. And I suppose you get a general, any illusions you might have had about, you know, the general kindness of people, or about, you know, most people aren't violent, you know, you see that this does happen. There are some dreadful people out there, and there's awful hatred, and that, yeah, people take it out on each other in physical ways. And I think seeing things like that, being around when that sort of thing happens, I don't know whether it made it easier to write the book. I think it certainly made it easier to understand things like the fear that you feel in those situations, because certainly I did. You know,
yeah,
I can imagine. Scary situation.
I can imagine. Yes, and you do paint that really, you know, because I'm definitely, when I'm reading them, I'm on the edge of my seat, because I'm like going, oh my goodness, this is frightening. And that's partly because, yes, the story itself, but also because the way you take us into empathy with the characters, and that you take us into really how they're feeling at different times, and especially if they're being pursued or abducted or whatever. So yeah, it's yes, definitely in that feeling of being, I think all of us in London, you know, walk these streets with awareness of quite a lot of stuff goes on, right? Around stuff goes on.
Yeah.
Stuff goes on. And so we all have to walk the streets with that awareness, especially at night time. And so sometimes the way you describe, you know, your heroine walking the streets, and then that feeling, oh, she might be being watched or stalked, or, you know, or there might, yeah, all of those things are very kind of things that we can all empathize with. I'm sure we've all had a moment where we thought, is that person watching me? Or you know, it's something we can all relate to, those kind of fears. So yeah, thank you. They're so well drawn, the crime side of it. So yeah, I was just curious to know, and great to hear that you were, that it draws on your experiences. It's fantastic. because it's always fascinating. I always find there's a story, always there's the book, and then there's the story behind the book as well, isn't there? The story of you writing it and the story of your life story, and that's what we're exploring. And what about people's responses to the books? You know, how have they been? Have there been some that particularly touched you, or how have people responded?
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the absolute joys and delights, frankly, of daring to publish, you know, of putting it out into the world, because especially with the first book, I mean, my goodness, you're so anxious as to what people are going to say. And of course, I did it a little bit at a time, in that, you know, there were various professionals who'd seen it, and then there was a group of not always friends, but certainly people who I knew who'd offered to be advanced readers and give me feedback and that sort of thing. But I can remember getting that first feedback and just the relief, not least that people understood what I was trying to do. Yes. And I think that was hugely important, that what I'd set out to do was tell a particular sort of story and to weave in these different strands, and that people got that yes, that worked. So enormous relief, first of all. There was one particular response, someone who had been given the book by a friend who thought she'd like it. And she came up and we actually met, and she came up and told me, oh, I've read your book. And she said, at the time when I was reading it, my mother was really ill. And she actually, I think, went on and it was a terminal illness. She did die. She said, during that period, which was incredibly difficult, it was so lovely to be able to just completely escape into the book. And whilst I was reading it, I wasn't thinking about anything else. And it was just a real escape for me. And I thought, oh my goodness, you know, I was almost in tears. It was so lovely to hear. Because really that's what I wanted, was to write something that would catch someone up so much that they could forget about everything else whilst they were reading it, and that they would really just get pleasure and enjoyment and excitement out of. I mean, the fact that someone gets that much out of something that I've written, I still find, you know, really quite extraordinary. And yeah, I've had some lovely reviews, and that's just been fantastic, that people, you know, people telling me that they stayed up half the night reading it because they couldn't put it down. I mean, you know, sorry, but that's just absolute music to my ears completely. You know, it's so lovely to hear people say things like that, because that's what you work towards. You know, it's not accidental. It's things like writing a chapter and stopping it at the point where you think you'd have to read on. You know, that thing. I mean, as a child, I was one of those kids, you know, one more chapter, just finish this page, reading under the bedclothes. And so I know that there are points where you have to keep reading. And that's what maybe not when I'm writing the first draft, but certainly when I'm editing, that's what I'm aiming for, is to finish the chapter at the point where someone really just wants to read the next chapter to see what happens. Yes. So that's lovely. In some ways, I mean, obviously not all of the reviews are good, and any author will say that they occasionally, you know, make the mistake of going and reading the reviews on Goodreads or on Amazon, and there's always one, and you can read 10 great reviews, and then there's one that isn't great, and that is the one that you could repeat word for word 2 years later. You know? It's always the case. Now they actually bother me less than they did. I honestly can say that, because I do see that they're outweighed by the positive ones. And, you know, you can shrug your shoulders. Not everyone's going to like everything that you write, and that's fine. And, you know, I don't like everything I read, and, you know, other people might. So I've learned not to take it personally in the same way. I think the thing that might have bothered me more is people who are close to me reading it, and what they might have thought. I have to say, the first time my parents read my book, I did find myself thinking, oh gosh, how many swear words were there in it? Things like that. And you know, And how dark does it get? And the things, the books, I mean, some of them do get quite dark. And I do have friends who say, God, Anna, you know what, you wouldn't know what goes on in your head. And occasionally my husband will sort of look at me when he's read something and say, how do you think of these things?
That's
Well,
our imagination.
It's imagination, and it's a writer's imagination, which, I mean, never say to a writer, what's the worst that can happen? Because, just get me started. I mean, I can think of 1,000 things that are the worst things that can happen. And I suppose in a way that's what I'm doing when I'm writing scary things in thrillers, is holding up something that would terrify me and thinking, okay, so how is my heroine going to deal with this? These things happen, so how do you deal with them? So it's almost like a bit of a rehearsing.
Yes, absolutely. And these things, what I loved is the way that you make the literary story very relevant to threats that we might experience today. So, for example, with the last the Peacock Room about William Blake, the fact that you had woven in Blake's artwork with the idea of a contemporary artist who more or less bastardizes that and turns it into something for their own agenda on the internet. And we know that happens. And I'm not going to give away too much of the plot, but really turns it to a very dark purpose. And we know that there is lots of stuff on the web that can be very threatening and can be serving agendas that are really scary. But it was really great to see that being tackled, and that you were brave enough to go into that world. Imagine what it might be like if that world started then spilling out into, and there's this point where the villain who's manufacturing this art suddenly says, right, now it's time to take this into the world, and you're going, no, it's bad enough online, like, so but it's that stepping up of sort of danger levels. And of course that's great for building the suspense in the book, but also it happens in our lives, doesn't it? A lot of threats start sort of in the imagination, and then fortunately, as I think there was one author who said, most of the things I'm frightened of have never happened yet. but there is a lot of stuff, isn't there, in our imagination which fortunately never comes to pass, because of just life is generally can be a bit kinder than that. But then sometimes your worst fear does happen, and the worst we do see it happen. And that's why it's good that you've had the bravery to go into those places, because they're happening, sadly.
Well, I think, I mean, with the Peacock Room, I noticed how much abuse, really unpleasant, worse than unpleasant, dreadful abuse, a lot of women in the public eye get online, and how vicious it can be. And I'm not someone who has ever attracted anything like that, thank goodness. Purely, I'm sure, because I don't have a high enough profile. But the sort of abuse that women politicians get, and campaigners and so on. And I sort of becoming aware of this around about 2016, 17, 18, I suppose, when the idea for the Peacock Room was starting to come through, and just thinking, well, where does this come from? Who are these people? And so I did a bit of, background research and reading, and, looked at what sort of things were. I followed a whole load of female politicians on Twitter just to see what the responses were to what they posted. And it was really shocking. Whether you agree with their politics or not was completely irrelevant. And then, of course, tragically, we have seen politicians being actually killed by people who one would have hoped would have just stuck to their bedroom, as a keyboard warrior. So it did make me think, well, there's a dangerous movement here, and anything that really bugs me, eventually I think I have to write about it, really, just to kind of face it and look at it and try and make some kind of sense of it, I suppose. I think that's what I'm nearly always doing with writing, is trying to make sense of something by writing about it.
That's a really powerful testimony, and that's certainly I've found that about writing, and sometimes it's just a moment, isn't it? Just a moment that you're trying to make sense of, and sometimes it's something much bigger that requires a lot more unraveling, and that theme that you've just described about online abuse and how that might transfer to life, and has transferred to life in really tragic ways, we know. That whole theme that of course, that's a big thing and you've explored that across the whole novel. And I love that you say that that's therapeutic for you. And I wondered, whether you've also seen in your teaching of other people, whether you've seen that that's also therapeutic for others when you're helping people find their writing voice, or anyone who's thinking of finding their voice. Have you seen that be therapeutic or beneficial for them?
No, I probably haven't done enough teaching to see that in other people. I mean, therapeutic is, I'm not sure that's quite the right word. It's more about helping to think about it, helping to think it through. It doesn't necessarily offer any comfort, quite the reverse sometimes. But it allows, I suppose what writing can do is allow you to think about something in a reasonably safe space, because you're setting the boundaries here. You're deciding what can or can't happen. I don't know how therapeutic fiction can be. I know that it's something that I need to do. I'm not sure that I do it as for therapeutic reasons. I think,
Maybe more cathartic then, or just that sense, as you say, of having a good old grapple with an issue, and that's, I guess I've found that sometimes, there's just a moment, and I feel like just happened recently. I was on a train and was passing just one man in a mask and a black hat, and he was just like an ink blot against the station, which was, just all this kind of beige kind of paneling. And it was just him on the station and me on my own in the train. It just said something about the solitariness of this time that we've just been through to me. Yes. But it took me a while to write the poem to figure out, what does that just mean to me? But for some reason, just for that split second of passing him in the train, it just, his figure caught my attention. And sometimes it's just, isn't it, just being able to go, why did that strike me? I just need to make sense of it in some words, and then processing. Maybe it's the word, it doesn't have to be therapeutic necessarily, but just processing, unraveling. There's lots of words I think we could use, isn't there? But anyway. And that is
no, I think grappling with things and catharsis.
And wonderful. That's really great. And I also loved that in the book you had a chorister in your last book, and I wondered if you could say anything about having explored singing and the singing voice and the written voice, and anything about that you've observed as well, because they're all voices.
They are. Well, I mean, joining the choir was simultaneously the scariest thing and the best thing that I had done for years. I enjoyed it hugely, but I was really terrified of joining the choir, because I hadn't sung since school, and at school I had, I guess, learned that I had a terrible singing voice and I shouldn't really sing, so I just didn't sing for however many years that was. I mean, for me, singing in the choir was almost like the antithesis of writing, in that it's such a communal thing. And that was what's so lovely about it. And in fact, that's what gave me the courage to actually do it at all, was that I wasn't having to listen to my voice. I was, adding my voice to the lovely noise that everybody else was making, and hoping to add to it rather than make it worse. But this kind of this beautiful communal feeling where everyone's adding something and you're making something that's more than some of your parts, which is choral singing, was just absolutely joyful, and it enabled me to enjoy music and making music in a way that I hadn't done since I was a kid. And I mean, I love listening to lots of different types of music, actually, but I really love listening to singing. And there's something about particularly sort of early music for me. So, Purcell, Thomas Tallis, and those sort of, Bach, listening to choral work that they've written is just enormously uplifting. I've never seen myself as a spiritual person, but you feel something very, bigger than yourself and kind of uplifting with those kind of pieces of music. I heard Thomas Tallis' Speminalium again on the radio just the other day, and it is just so glorious. And there's something about that. And I'd always sort of watched it and thought, God, wouldn't it be amazing to be one of those voices? And, our choir isn't quite doing Speminalium yet. But some of the songs that we did with lots of different parts and it all sort of swelling together felt just glorious. And I really, really got so much out of being able to do that. And I didn't really think that it had gone into my writing until, as you said, I realised, well, I have written a choir boy. And this choir boy, Josh, who is in the Crimson Thread, and he's one of the choristers at Canterbury Cathedral. And I think I started off wanting to write him because I thought, it would just be, he'd be a good character to have, a small inquisitive boy who might see things that other people didn't see. And, he'd be sort of a good ally for Helen in finding clues and so on. And then I realized that in order to write about him meaningfully, music is the big thing in his life. It's the most important thing in his life. It's why he's there. And I had to be able to write about how he felt when he sang. And I just wouldn't have had a clue where to start if I hadn't been singing in the choir. So I did write about, him feeling this glorious uplifting when they're all singing together, and this sort of feeling of rising up into the air. And I think I wrote something about them sort of, it was like they were, playing in the clouds and kind of rolling down each other's voices up the other side and this sort of thing, which did come very much from how I felt in some of the singing that we'd done together, and this sort of buoying up that I'd enjoyed. So yeah, it was an experience that I wouldn't have had and I hadn't previously had, that I could then begin to write about when I was writing Josh as a character. So yeah, that was it was great. And I think if I'd not been able to write about how Josh felt when he was singing, he wouldn't have been a whole character.
That's so beautiful. And I was particularly struck with the beauty of that passage where you describe how he feels about being in the choir and the sound of the choir, and also how he uses singing. Again, I'm not giving any the plot away, but he uses singing to help him get, shall I say, found or rescued? I don't want to give too much away. So he uses singing in a powerful way, and that again, I was like, woo, look at that, So, and yeah, again, just this understanding of there's so many levels of our voice, and it was so lovely having you sing with us in the choir. And as you say, we're not quite Thomas Tallis because we are a community choir, but it's joyful. It's joyful. Singing is absolutely a joyful experience, and that's what I love, is the parts all coming together and building, as you say, that whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So that's beautifully articulated. Thank you. And you've given us lots and lots of insight. Thank you so much. It's just been so valuable, and I'm sure everyone listening's really benefited from it, and I hope is feeling intrigued to go out and read these amazing books. Please do go and find Anna. Where's your website, Anna?
It's annasayburn.com.
Fantastic, thank you. And also, if you had, I know you've shared quite a few tips with us about finding the writing voice in terms of, choose the everyday, use the everyday things, the texting. If there's any kind of parting thoughts you'd like to leave anyone thinking that they might write, but they're feeling a bit scared about it, or they want to explore more of their writing voice, what would you say?
Yeah. Well, something that I don't think I realized when I started writing fiction is it's like anything else. You get better at it the more you do. Yeah. You need to practice. Like if you were playing the violin, you'd practice, and the more you practice, the better you get. And a lot of people say write every day. I mean, ideally, yes. Do I write every day? No, of course I don't. But the more that you can, the better. try and find a place in your day that works for you to write. I quite often start off before I write, before I go into the novel, I've got a notebook, and I just sit there with a pencil and a notebook, and I kind of write down whatever's in my head at the moment, for half an hour, or until I feel that I want to move on to the book. Sometimes it's just really useful to clear all of the stuff out of your head that you're kind of worrying about. I mean, particularly at the moment, it's really difficult sometimes. You hear these terrible headlines on the news about dreadful things happening in Ukraine, and you think, oh, how can I go and write fiction after listening to all this? And you sort of, the answer is, well, it's not going to make it any better for anyone if you don't, So we all have our jobs to do, but sitting down and writing down all of the things that are bugging me, that are worrying me, sometimes just writing about, isn't it a beautiful morning, and look, I can see the plum blossom out the window and how pretty it is, and listen to the bird song. It just helps me clear the day, but it also creates a kind of a writing practice, and it also it's my time where I can write anything I want. So if I want to just try something out, if I want to try and write a poem, which I very rarely do, I can write it then. It's your time. No one can tell you what to write. Experiment, write anything and everything you want, and just see how it goes. If you do want to write fiction, actually, I really do recommend doing creative writing courses, because I learned a huge amount, which I think enabled me to write my first novel. I think I might have got there in the end, but it certainly helped an enormous amount to understand what I was trying to do and to learn the techniques. And this is it, you wouldn't try and learn the violin just by picking up a violin and sort of sawing away at it once a day.
Yes.
You'd go and get a teacher and you'd learn. And I think it's similar with writing. People say, oh, you can't teach people to write. Well, you can. You can't teach people to write like another person necessarily, because they will have their own voice and they'll find their own voice. Maybe you can't teach people to write brilliantly, but you can certainly teach people to write better. And the more you practice, as I said, the better that you'll get. So give it a try.
Thank you. And that's very true of many things, isn't it? Because I think, and it's the same I would say for the singing voice, is that really we're not teaching people to do it, like somebody else does it. We're just trying to provide tools to help people find the voice that's inside them, which is unique to them. And that will be the same whether it's written or sung or spoken. It's unique. And it's just finding that sometimes we need those forms and those places, and also some tools and some guidance or some structures. Like you said, you were looking for help with structure. There was something particularly that you wanted help with, and so then you found that, and that's sped up the process, for you. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's really great to learn. It's really fantastic to learn, and that also whatever learning has, hopefully, that we have supports that expression of our voice and our uniqueness. And there are some wonderful workshops like your own to come and experience that, and to come and share that, and also be in a supportive environment as well. I think it's good, isn't it, to see other people, like you described about the choir, the communal sense. And I'm sure that happens in writing groups in a different way, but that sense of we're all on a creative endeavor here together, so let's support each other's voice.
You've just reminded me of something. One of the things that I learned in the choir was that my singing voice is much lower than I'd assumed it was. And once I knew that, that's fine. I could now find, where I felt comfortable singing my register. And I think there's a similar thing with writing. A good teacher will help you find the thing you're really good at. Maybe you've actually got a fantastically funny turn of phrase. Maybe you've got a really interesting slantways way of looking at the world. A good teacher will kind of try and help you find what you're really good at, where you feel comfortable writing.
Brilliant. That's beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. It's finding your uniqueness. And we've had singers speaking actually on some of our other episodes, it reminds me of Jill Manley, who came on quite early when I started the podcast, and she talked about that. She talked about one of her teachers teaching her that the breaks in her voice were actually the strengths, and she'd always been worried because most people have what we call a break in the voice between registers, and it's totally normal and fine, but it sounds a bit more dramatic than it really is. But she's actually had two, which was really unusual, and she was like, thinking there was something wrong. But her teacher had a good teacher who showed her, no, that's an asset, and this is how you sing, to use that. So as you say, it's about bringing out, and sometimes what we consider to be our eccentricities or our vulnerabilities can actually be our strengths, if surprisingly. So thank you for your encouragement and for encouraging everyone listening to go that journey, because it's so rich, isn't it? And it's just wonderful.
And it's fun. It's great fun telling stories.
Telling stories, exactly. Our world is driven by stories, isn't it? Headlines, everything, like you say, it's all about storytelling. How do we tell our stories? And I just want to thank you for sharing your story with us today, and all the beautiful stories you've woven in your books, which are just such a joy and so enlightening and multi-layered to encounter. So thank you very much, Anna, for coming to talk to us today.
Thank you so much, Katie. That's lovely.
Thank you, and look forward to hearing more about the next novel. So as Anna said, check her out at annasayburn.com, and please watch out for the new novel. We'll all be watching out for that, and also for forthcoming creative workshops, creative writing workshops, and to stay tuned to the podcast. Thank you again for listening. Please do subscribe on YouTube or Apple Podcasts. Do let us know how you feel about this. What's your experience of finding your written voice? Let us know. Drop us a comment or a line. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much for listening, everyone, and look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Vocal Revolution. Thank you again to my special guest, Anna. Thank you.